The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark.
Glory to you, Lord.
Again, Jesus left the district of Tyre and went by way of Sidon to the Sea of Galilee, into the district of the Decapolis. And people brought to him a deaf man who had a speech impediment, and begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him off by himself away from the crowd. He put his finger into the man's ears and spitting touched his tongue. Then he looked up to heaven and groaned and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened. His speech impediment was removed, and he spoke plainly. He ordered them not to tell anyone, but the more he ordered them not to, the more they proclaimed it. They were exceedingly astonished, and they said, "He has done all things well. He makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
The last time I flew up certain airlines whose name I won't mention, I counted 7 different classes of passengers. That's a real sharp contrast to today's second reading, in which St. James reminds us and warns us about making those kinds of class distinctions in our assembly of worship. As we heard, a worshiper comes in very well dressed and is directed to a choice place. Another worshiper comes in who is dressed poorly, and they are exiled off to the bleachers. And such discrimination is shamefully contrary to our faith. And yet, despite that it's written plainly in the Word of God, it never seems to have prevented us from practicing it. In the founding decades of our nation, people of color were welcome to worship with us as long as they went straight to the balcony and they came forward to share at the Lord's table after all the white folks were finished. That's our history. And even today, some of my brother priests will announce who can and who cannot come to the table, clearly choosing power and control over and above the grace of God that might be stirring in someone's soul. In my very first assignment, there was a parishioner, very faithful, but a bit of a character. And one Sunday, she put our second reading to the test. She showed up at Sunday Mass disguised as a homeless person. And her experience was quite telling, because people who usually would have said hello to her just kind of looked away. Others averted their eyes. Others kind of glared, but at a distance, kept watching her, see what she's up to. And then after Mass, at the social center, she stood up in front of everyone and removed her wig and wiped off her makeup and pulled off the clothes she had on. And everyone saw who she really was. And the reactions moved from astonishment to laughter and then embarrassment and finally some really feeble attempts at justifying behavior. And yet the lesson learned that day is not nearly as radical as we hear in today's reading. What we tend to hear is James is calling us simply to be impartial, that we should treat everyone fairly and equally. And there's really nothing wrong with that, except that James is going even further than that. And that will be very clear to us in the coming weeks. James is in fact trying to move us to a different kind of partiality. He's trying us to make us to be the partiality that God expresses, the partiality that God demonstrates. You see, our understanding, our image for justice here in the United States is the image of that blindfolded woman holding a pair of perfectly balanced scales. But the biblical image of justice is a God who sets things right. In the scriptures, God is not impartial. God chooses the weak and the marginalized. The biblical image of justice, of God's justice, will be much closer to the famous painting of liberty leading the people. Because the Bible presents to us a God who redeems, a God who sets free, a God who is on the side of the poor. From the Exodus out of Egypt to Mary's Magnificat, to the story of the rich man and Lazarus, to Matthew 25 and the corporal works of mercy, to Jesus himself identifying with the marginalized and the sinners, dying as a criminal and conquering death in the resurrection. God is not impartial. The preferential option for the poor sounds a little difficult for us to grasp, but let me bring it down very close to home literally. Because in a family, when someone's going through a hard time, when there's difficulties, someone's been given a bad diagnosis, lost their job, going through divorce, everyone in that family unit adjusts. Everyone chips in some way. Some folks adjust their schedule, someone else gives up their beds, someone goes to sleep on the couch, someone might stay home and leave their job, someone might add a job to get more income in. Everyone adjusts to rally around the person who is struggling. That's the preferential option for the poor, except here we're speaking about doing the same thing on the level of the church or the level of the economy or politics or the social order. James's point is that the church, the community of disciples, is not called to be impartial, but rather we are to be the signs of God's grace. We are to be mindful that the very ones for whom the world has little regard are in fact the guests of honor in the reign of God. And yes, on earth as it is in heaven.